Chapter 6. Prudence had been sure she'd know once she saw Ernest, once she looked into his eyes, and she did know one thing. He had not consciously caused the storm. He was not evil or even misguided. He was bewildered. What she didn't know was if he was the reason for the storm, which was a different way of being responsible. He could still have done something to trigger it. Or this dimension could be the problem, and he was a side issue. Did she need to kill him or recruit him? Could she execute the final option? Her heart said no. Her brain said she had to but didn't think she could do it either. She wasn't a killer. They all knew that, and they'd let her go, so they didn't think she'd have to either, she reminded herself. She knew what she wanted to do, but what if what she wanted to be true blinded her to what really was? She should have told her father that she wasn't unbiased enough for this mission, but if she had, she wouldn't have just lost the mission. She'd have been out of the agency. Do not get emotionally involved with dimensional iterations was one of the rules an agent couldn't break and remain an agent, the line that could not be crossed. Ever. Someone should have told her why the line couldn't be crossed. It might have made a difference. Maybe. Knowing how much it could hurt might have headed her off. It was human nature to risk pain, to pursue the unreachable, to dream big and try harder. Being an agent required all of those things. She'd broken bones learning to navigate dimensions. It hadn't stopped her. A broken heart, well, that was a different kind of pain, particularly in a hopeless cause. If she'd known, she'd have tried not to let it happen, wouldn't she? Only she had let it happen. And she'd come to protect Ernest. She knew it, even if she didn't want to admit it. Not because she thought that this time she'd get him, but because she couldn't let him die unless, but what if she had to? He was one Ernest in thousands, only he wasn't. He was an aberrant Ernest. And therefore unique. Special. Against special, there was only the fate of innumerable dimensions. Billions of lives, including those of her family, depending on her to make the right decision. To do the right thing. No pressure. She needed more information, but it wouldn't be easy. This Ernest was like the others in one essential way. He was a scientist. He probably couldn't believe one impossible thing, let alone 6, if she had a month of mornings to spend. Which she didn't. She had one night to get him from skeptical to helpful. And she could only think of one way to make that happen. Break the other unbreakable rule. Never tell an iteration they are an iteration, or that dimensions could be crossed. Since she was already in for a pound, why wasn't she spilling the beans? Because a part of her, a very small part of her, wasn't sure she was right. If Ernest was a bad guy, very good at pretending to be good, and she told him? Well, it wouldn't just be bad. It would be catastrophic. 6 impossible things. Was this what it was like through the looking glass? There was a small one tacked to the wall, but Ernest didn't go to it when he clambered to his feet. Instead, he made his way, somewhat shakily, to the slightly open window and looked out. An unfamiliar diffuse light revealed chunky blocks of stone and sea. From here it appeared that the house stood in the sea, was surrounded by it. As unsettling as that was, what still struck him the most was the silence. He should have heard something. The sound of gulls. The slap of water against rock. Something. Here was one impossible thing he had to believe, whether he wanted to or not. And it was true that the storm behaved like no storm he'd observed or read about. He turned from the window, from the silence, but not toward her. Losing Ophelia had not been the impossible. People died. It was a fact of life. He'd seen it before. He'd seen it after. Seeing her in that storm, his hands clenched at his sides. It had been Ophelia, but not the way he remembered her. Her eyes when alive had been, well, he could not recall exactly. But not like the eyes in the storm. Those eyes, that face had not been. A faint shudder shook him. "What did you see in the storm, Dr. Warren?" Her voice was soft, but something in it, an urgency perhaps, made him turn around and face her. He opened his mouth but could not say the words. "You saw her, didn't you?" After a pause, he gave a short, sharp nod. "How did you know?" "You're not the only one to see the specter of a loved one in the storm." Her gaze shifted away from his, but not before he caught sight of sadness in them that he recognized. "You have lost someone." She nodded. "In the storm?" She shook her head. "I've read witness accounts." She looked past him in the direction of the storm. "This will be my first contact with it." Her gaze shifted seaward. "If that is the storm, why are you here?" Why had Masterson sent her? Why had he sent a woman? And what did she, or he, expect to happen? She didn't speak for so long he thought she wouldn't. Finally she stirred, her lips curving wryly up. She looked at him once more. "To stop the storm." Her tone said it was obvious. His brows shot up even though some part of him was, strangely, not surprised. "That would be one of the impossible things I am supposed to believe?" She smiled, transforming her face in such a way that it caused his heart to thump oddly. Only 5 more to go. Chapter 7. Ernest was recovering. He was thinking. That could be good. That could be bad. He was like the other Ernests, but also different. His wanderings in his airship had altered him. She'd like to think he'd grown, matured, become less rigid. She wasn't sure, though. She might be, not just hopeful but dangerously hopeful. She still found it hard to believe that all those Ernests had loved all those Ophelias. In an effort at impartiality, she'd spent some time with some of them, trying to see what he saw. That had only made it harder. Some were not so bad, but none were what she'd call worthy of great devotion. Most had started to make their Ernest unhappy on the heels of their wedding vows. The Ophelias weren't outright evil, and they did show some sense in wanting Ernest, even if he was totally wrong for them. The main problem was, they couldn't leave well enough alone. They wanted things for the Ernests that the Ernests didn't want for themselves. Like wanting him to work for her daddy, and give up that crazy inventing. They couldn't see what he was because they were too focused on what they wanted him to be. It should have helped her get over Ernest because he'd done the proposing, but to be fair, how did a man of his time, or all the times when women were limited so severely, find spouses who were a match for them? Even in her time men, even smart men, fell for the pretty face without looking any deeper and sometimes regretted it. Within the agency she had sometimes felt the sting of being judged as a girl instead of for her talent, though not as much as at school. All that had mattered in high school was her poodle skirt, and who thought she was a cutie. And the guy who thought she was a cutie had to have a souped-up dragster, or having a guy wasn't enough to make one cool. Inside the agency, she had a future, but without it? Her guidance counselor had urged her toward nurse or school teacher or secretary. If he could see her now, he'd probably cry like a girl. Though to be fair to him, it also bothered him when she rolled up to his car on her skates. He had wanted better for her than a drive-in job, and couldn't know she needed a for-show job that let her do her real job. Honestly, she didn't know if she was a cutie or a dog. She'd been told her looked like her grandmother, the one married to the missing grandfather. She'd never met either. Didn't want to cause a paradox. Those didn't get you kicked out, because most likely you'd erase yourself from history before they could kick you out. The problem with popping through dimensions, you didn't get a lot of time to date. And if one made the mistake of getting a crush on an iteration, yeah, that tended to kill your love life too. She knew she didn't feel comfortable with the idea of seeing herself through someone else's eyes, letting that dictate how she saw herself. So that put her out of step with her peers too. Even though she pined for Ernest, she didn't pine to the point of despair. She tried to keep it wistful, though she had to fight a bit of melancholy after a mission. But she'd always known she couldn't have him. If you started out with no hope, the only way to go was up. At least in theory. But she couldn't remember ever wondering what was wrong with her, because it was obvious the problem lay with Ernest. And guys in general, who forgot to use the correct brain when choosing a life's companion. There was a clink as Ernest set down his utensils and the scrape as he pushed his chair back from the rough-hewn table. He'd agreed to eat, perhaps hoping she'd be a better cook than his automaton crew. Oh well. He'd eaten. She could have done better in her own time, of course. She'd taken home EC. But it didn't prepare one for a wood stove. He studied her now, with his scientist look back on his face. She'd seen it before this meeting, over and over again on the faces of the other Ernests. She held the look without flinching or blinking. She could have held it in her sleep, except then her eyes would be closed. He looked away first, though his gaze quickly returned. No one can stop a storm, he said flatly, as if he'd been thinking while he ate and drank. Which he probably had. All the Ernest Warrens were brilliant scientists, ahead of their time, which made the Ophelias not just wrong but blindly stupidly wrong. All of them but this one had directed their brilliance toward inventing things, though all of them had allowed the inventing to become after-work hobbies. Only this one had turned his attention to the elements, but he still invented things, according to Dr. Masterson. This iteration, this Ernest, focused on inventing weather instruments that he hoped would help him figure out the weather. Was that a clue to the storm's interest? Maybe he'd invented a way to stop it, but didn't know it? This is not a normal storm, she pointed out, her tone mild. She rose and began clearing the table, partly because it was expected, and partly to avoid that look of distrust in his eyes. She set some dishes in the big farm sink and turned around. You are saying this storm is man-made? He could not keep the disbelief out of his voice. I did not. I don't know what's causing the storm, she added before he could ask. She crossed her arms over her chest. You've seen it up close. Is it normal? He glared at her, then looked away again. It is atypical, he conceded some ground, but not all of it since he used the word atypical again. It is unnatural, she asserted, because he needed to get that far if they were going to make any progress toward those other impossible things he needed to believe. The study of weather. Science may not be ready to admit this is unnatural, doctor, but you know it with your other sense. Your instinct. She rested her hands on the table and leaned in. Could she say gut in this time? The need hadn't come up before. He should have good instincts, after wandering around the world for 4 years. Your mind may dispute this because minds don't like the unnatural, but you know in your gut and your heart what it is. Did he still have a heart? Was it still broken? The distrust in his eyes was more than the others, but this one had a better reason for that distrust. His mouth straightened into a thin, tight line. But he gave a short, sharp nod that might have been a concession. But if you don't know what is causing it, then how do you propose to stop it? He didn't try to soften his scorn. Ah. He'd put a finger on the painful crux of the matter. Stalling for time, she returned his serve. You're the weatherman. Is this another of your impossible things? I have just begun my research on weather phenomenon. A mystery such as this one is well beyond my skills. Maybe, but the storm doesn't seem to know that. What? The single word was snapped. What are you talking about? It's following you. Either you're attracting it, she paused, with the sense that she was close to knowing something, just not close enough to know what she knew. Or you have something it wants. She frowned. What could a storm want? What could a storm want? He echoed her thought, but with even more scorn than before. That's a very good question. She said it slowly, her thoughts spinning, but with a stronger feeling of something important just out of her reach. She sighed. Let's start with this. She reached for the map she'd left leaning against the table leg, pushing aside the cutlery and dishes she hadn't cleared, so that she could spread it out on the surface of the table. Against his will, interest sparked in his eyes. For a map. She sighed a little inside. What is this? He bent over it, studying it, as if he couldn't wait for her answer. He must figure it out for himself. His turn to frown. It's a map of the world. A most detailed map. Definitely better than anything he had access to, but hindsight was 20/20. What are these marks? He asked. Those are storm sightings. I didn't realize there'd been so many. There hadn't been. In this dimension. But he wasn't ready to hear that. He looked at it without speaking for several minutes, then frowned, his gaze narrowing. But I know. Our people have studied it too. The dates, the places, there doesn't seem to be a pattern. She looked up, meeting his gaze. It doesn't move in what we'd call a logical manner. It pops up, disappears, then pops up half a world away. If the reports are even slightly accurate, the first sighting was in Russia. Then it moved here to Canada. Then to Egypt. Persia. Lots of appearances over oceans. And well, you can see it for yourself. I can, but this makes no sense. He'd forgotten to be annoyed with her. Now he was puzzled. Curious. What are these additional notations? Places where people were missing after the storm. The ones we know about. Sometimes there weren't people to say if people were missing. His gaze dropped. So not every time? That we know about. She hesitated, but it had to be asked. Were you at any of these places? No. I know not when the storm was there, but at any other time, before or after. Yeah, it was straw grabbing, but straws were all she had right now. His finger touched the map, tracing a path only he knew. He'd written Dr. Masterson about the weather, but hadn't mentioned where he was or outlined his route. It was as if his mind had become hyper-focused. So much so that when he'd gone airborne, only the weather had mattered. Where he was for that weather was incidental. Only he knew exactly where and when he'd been. His finger tracked up to New York. He'd met Dr. Masterson there and bonded with him, then across the Atlantic. The only thing they knew for sure, he'd avoided this continent, avoided Galveston and the southern United States. For 4 years. And had only been coaxed back by the storm and Dr. Masterson's urging. It had taken some tricky dimensional travel, getting Dr. Masterson here in time to meet Ernest the first time. She still wondered what the good doctor thought of him, though this was his only Ernest. Finally, his finger stopped moving. Here. This is the only place both I and the storm have both been. But my visit was long before the storm, months before. She leaned over. Persia. She rested her elbows on the map. She could tell by the way the symbol was rendered that the storm had not been in Persia in this dimension. Which was, well, puzzling. Okay, after Persia the storm tracked toward England. But stopped off the coast. This time in this dimension. A ship was lost at sea, that may or may not have been because of it. There were no survivors to talk to. The Covington. He frowned again. What's the date? He bent to look for himself, then sat back with a frown. There was a geological expedition that I spent some time with in Persia. One of them was from England. I think I could be wrong, but I feel like I heard that ship mentioned. Maybe by him. He looked up. This is ridiculous. He was right, but it was the first time there'd been even the faintest sign of anything. Isn't that how science works? You start with an inkling, a theory, and then follow it until it leads to something else or fades to nothing? He made a move that could have been agreement. This is something less than inkling. Even for science. He frowned deeply. That you consider it one tells me you have very little. I think saying we have very little is being wildly optimistic of you. She grinned at him, and he almost grinned back before he caught himself. Look at the other locations. Any of them related to your expedition? Or your travels? What about the people? She handed him a list. This is very incomplete, but any of the names ring a bell? He was quiet for long enough that she felt hope wane. Then he spoke slowly, almost absently. They were from all over, but I don't know precisely where, possibly Canada. Mexico. England? I wasn't overly interested in their names or where they came from, as I was in what they were doing. They were geologists, surveyors, drillers. They were looking for petroleum reserves for the Shah. So it was easy to keep them at a distance if he didn't know their names and stories. Keep it all from getting too personal. Personal led to personal questions. Questions that would remind him of what he'd lost. He'd surrounded himself with automations to get away from the personal. What prompted you to stop there? He was going to get over answering questions, even personal ones. He shot her a look. I was in Tehran getting supplies. Someone, an agent perhaps, asked me to check on them. They'd missed a meeting or something. Might be low on supplies. I had room, so I took some things for them, in addition to my own, in case I ran across them. Prudence straightened. Really? She didn't remember enough to know when they'd started hunting oil in the Middle East. Hadn't needed to know. An agent had a crap load of stuff to remember, and what they couldn't remember got pre-loaded into their gear, but it wasn't like all of it could be stored there. They had to pick and choose. Her upload had focused on the meteorological, not geology. Was it a company or individual behind it? The question was more rhetorical, so she surprised at his reaction. He stiffened first, then shifted in his chair. They weren't saying it was confidential to prevent speculation, but one of them slipped and mentioned a name. I gave them my word I'd forget. Which would be the one thing to make sure you never forgot. Person or company? Ernest's lips thinned again. We need a name. I gave my word. I promise not to speculate. She waited a few seconds. It could be important. Still he didn't speak. Men and their word. Just then, Winston appeared in the doorway. There's a gentleman to see you, sir. Ernest blinked. Prudence was more like stunned. They were on an island for Pete's sake. How had he come? Airship? Boat? Magic carpet ride? To see me? How? He stopped, obviously realizing the automaton wouldn't have an answer to the question. Did he give a name? Winston held out a calling card. Ernest took it, stiffening. He looked up. Tell him we'll be with him shortly. Only after the automaton had left did Ernest hand her the card. Prudence read it. Lord Henry. She started to shrug, then it hit her. Him? He's the guy? Ernest nodded grimly. Prudence tapped the card against her thumb, her brows pulling together in a frown. How she'd have loved some time with the agency's main difference engine. Interesting. Interesting? I didn't even know I'd be here. How could he? His voice rose a bit. It's impossible. Number 2 on our impossible things list? Though not the number 2 she'd been expecting. His arrival was very interesting. And disturbing. Profoundly disturbing. She might be in more trouble than she realized. You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.